1. Ever since I was 14 years old, I've been scared of lightning. It started when I was out on a soccer field during a thunderstorm and lightning struck the fence, just over 100 feet away from me. The sound was deafening, and I can still remember the awful sensation of the sound vibrating through my whole body. But this wouldn't be my only incident involving a lightning strike that I came too close to. The next time it wouldn't only scare me, it would also be my salvation. When I turned 20, I moved out of my parents who lived in the capital of my country to a small community in the south. And I have no intention of moving back. Sure, a girl who grew up in the city is used to the endless variation of restaurants, bars, stores that never close, and a city that never sleeps. But I like it here, despite the low population of the community and something of a sleepy town stamp on it. It is charming with its colorful wooden houses, the seaside campus, and the smell of butter from the old butter factory, as an eternal reminder of where you are. I can practically go out whenever I want, wherever I want, and meet a total of 10 people, the neighborhood cats, and, if I'm lucky, a cute but lost hedgehog. There is one more reason why I appreciate living in a small town. It's how incredibly safe I feel here. In the city, you can barely be outside alone as a woman after 10 p.m., without feeling such discomfort that you feel compelled to check behind you once or twice every minute. All such discomfort, however, doesn't only happen after set time, or during the darkest hours of the day. It can happen at any time, but that is something you learn, something I had to learn. I was 17, and it was the summer holidays. I was spending most of it at my then-boyfriend's house, and he lived with his family about 20 minutes outside of the city. I lived with my parents at the time in the city center, just along the green subway line. So if I wanted to get back home, I had to take the commuter train to the central station, walk across it, and switch to the green subway line and ride a few minutes on there to get to my station. I was then in one of my rebellious periods and had a month before bleached my hair. I loved it at first, but after a while my roots started to show and I realized my mistake. My angel of a mother had tired of my fuss over it and booked me at a hairdresser so that I could go back to my natural deep brown hair color. The day for my appointment at the hairdresser came, and I was, as usual, at my boyfriend's, but I needed something from my parents' apartment first. So I put on my headphones and jumped on the commuter train. I switched, as usual, to the green line, and sat near one of the doors that I knew would line up perfectly to where I would get off. I like to crowd watch when I travel. Not to stare people out or anything like that, but just to look at people and think about where they are going. What do they do for work? Or maybe make up a story about them. It is kind of a game that I often find myself playing on the subway or commuter train. I played that game that day. I looked around at people, and when there was one station left until my stop, my eyes stuck to a man who was sitting a few feet in front of me. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-30s. His hair was dark and scruffy, wearing dark clothes and big boots. He sat with his elbows leaning against his knees, crouching slightly down towards the subway floor. Today I don't remember what my analysis or fictional story was of him, but I know I saw him. The woman in the speaker shouted out my destination, and I stood up and went to the doors and stepped off. When I got out of the doors of the station, I saw that it had started to rain, so I pulled my big hood over my headphones and started to quickly walk up to the apartment, which was only a few hundred feet from the station. The apartment is an old building with a large wooden door facing the street. The door has a glass pane that runs along the entire door, and when you enter, the staircase is entirely in marble with an old wooden elevator with an iron lattice door that you have to close manually. When I got to the door, I put in the entry code and pushed up the door. When the door swung aside, something was reflected in the glass. I turned around and saw the man from the subway standing behind me. At first I was a little shocked that he was so close to me, but I assumed he was one of my neighbors or a neighbor's friend. I also assumed that he stood so close to me because it rained and didn't want to get wet, so I said hello and pressed up the door an extra time with my hip while I took off my headphones. He did not answer. I went to the lift and pressed a button, but I heard that it did not start. So I assumed that the neighbors had opened the lattice door to park the elevator at their floor while they locked their door. I turned around and saw the man standing behind me, shaking. It was not a typical type of shaking that's common if you have a fever or a cold, more like a spastic twitching. He stood there jerking with his head and his back curved as he had on the subway. But this time his eyes were not on the floor, they were on me. He opened his mouth to talk, but only incoherent sounds came out, while the shaking and jerking became more frantic. "What's your name?" he said at last. I remembered my parents' words of wisdom to never tell your name to a stranger, especially one whom one feels threatened by. I wanted to tell him to go, but I felt like I was frozen and provoking him might make the situation worse. I replied with a false name. He then asked, "Do you live here?" I lied and answered that I don't, that I'm just here to see a friend. I remember thinking I was smart. Now he didn't know my name or where I lived, I thought. But it was now he started moving closer to me, I started backing. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, but he continued scuffing towards me. I heard the elevator engine start ticking, and that it was on its way down. He told me he has been following me on the train, that he saw me there, and that he just had to follow me. It was now that he lifted his head from his previous position, showing how tall he really was, and the shaking stopped. He spoke again. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." If I thought I was frozen before, that was an understatement. I was now pressed against the elevator door, and he was so close that I could feel his scent. Some may think that these words still have to be somewhat flattering, but the way he said it sounded like a death sentence, like something bad. Bad for me. It was about when I heard the elevator stop on the first floor and someone walk down the stairs to the courtyard door. That door is located on a small platform between the ground floor and the first floor stairs. You also know how you can recognize and distinguish your parents' steps from others? I did this with these steps that came down the stairs, and I heard they were my father's. I quickly thought that I would scream for him. But then I realized that the man would know that I first lied, and that he might get angry and do something to my old father. That was when my father opened the door to the courtyard, and the lightning struck the yard. The sound waves of the crackling lightning pressed itself through the open door, and made the whole marble stairwell scream. I screamed. The man screamed. I went to my usual position regarding thunder and lightning, fetal position on the floor. He, on the other hand, jumped backwards and started running out, while he shouted that we will be seeing each other again soon. I barely realized what had happened. I went crying up in the elevator and into the apartment where I told everything to my mother and also father when he came up from the courtyard. We reported the incident to the police, and I went and dyed my hair, which made me feel a little safer, as my appearance changed quite drastically. I was still a little scared after the incident, but also confused. I just kept thinking about what he was saying when he ran out. We will be seeing each other again soon. I knew at least that I absolutely did not want to see him again. However, I didn't get what I wanted. About a month passed, and I had absolutely forgotten about this situation. I was on my way to the central station to meet up with my boyfriend who was on the commuter train on his way to me. I stood and waited for him in the hallway between the commuter trains and the subway. In that particular hallway, a lot of people are walking, either to the trains or from the trains. Very few people are standing still in it. As I said, I stood there, looked down the hallway from time to time, to try to see if my boyfriend had come yet. When I see someone else standing still, there was someone standing on the other side of the crowd, and although everyone goes in different directions and creates a kind of blurred effect on him, I see who it is. I freeze just like before. He stares at me, not like our first meeting, but as if he's trying to make up if I am who he thinks I am behind the dark hair. Then my boyfriend comes from the crowd and hugs me, and I have to look away from the man a few seconds to hug him back. I leaned my head against his shoulder and looked over to see if the man was still there, but then he was gone. I have never seen him since. Has he seen me? Two, for anyone who doesn't know, Pokemon Go is basically a game where you run around town and catch Pokemon at monuments, churches, etc. When I was younger and first started playing, I lived in a small town where all the Pokestops, areas to catch Pokemon, available were in a square. Every once in a while I'd go to a corner where I could place lure modules to get a ton of Pokemon. This was cool and all until one day someone drove by and saw me and asked if I was playing Go. I said yes, and he drove away. About a minute later he showed up again and sat in his car. The area I was at was the front steps of my church, so I could see him in the parking lot. I didn't mind it since he wasn't bothering me, until he got out of his car and sat next to me. I immediately felt very bad vibes, and I don't think it was because of how skittish I can be when interacting with strangers. The dude smelled terrible, and like he had been drinking. He talked to me at first about the game, which was fine, and then he went on to start randomly talking about his love life and how terrible his wife was. He said he was looking for a new partner since he was planning on getting a divorce soon. Completely inappropriate, as I was barely 17 and looked even younger because of my size. As he talked, he would stop and stare at me after I responded for a very long time without saying anything. After the second time of this happening, I noped out of there and went home. I didn't play for a week because of how nervous he had made me, and also because he said he would frequently play for 12 hours without stopping by driving around the square of Pokestops. I thought that if I went out, I would surely run into him. I was at church the next Sunday, outside and waiting for service to start, and he drove by, saw me, and parked. I knew he didn't go to my church because of how small my town was, so I went inside, quickly, even though it was extremely hot, because the arcs had only just been turned on. For the next month of this, whenever he saw me, he would slow down and start talking to me as I either walked to my school or church. I hadn't played in my town for a very long time at this point. Only when I was at Walmart or something in the next town over. I switched pathways as soon as the stalking started. But it sucked because at some points on my way to either church or school I couldn't avoid a certain street he would show up on. I was young and didn't know what to do because this was my first time experiencing something like this. I stopped going to church and started riding the bus to school for months until I was sure he would assume I stopped playing. I didn't fully quit the game until months later when my cousin came to visit me. He suggested we go to my church to catch some Pokemon for a bit. I was a little scared but agreed, assuming the guy would finally be gone, and if he wasn't, my cousin would scare him away. Long story short, we get there, place the lure modules, and literally 10 minutes later I see the guy's car coming down the dirt pathway. I immediately tell my cousin to hide, and we both ran into a tiny building built for people to pray outside of church hours. The man gets out of his car and starts looking for either me or whomever placed the lure module. My cousin and I are stuck hiding in the prayer building until he finishes scouring the entire church for us, and we hear his car leave. I very much doubt he was there to catch Pokemon, as he only stayed to look around and then leave, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. After he left, I didn't tell my cousin about the stalking, just that he was a very bad person we didn't need to be around. My cousin was upset and called his mom to come get us because he didn't want to walk home. I quit the game for years. The reason I'm telling this story now is that I recently came back to my town to visit, and somehow, this guy was still playing the game. The original part of this story happened in 2016. This next part happened a week ago. I was sitting at a park and saw his car coming. I didn't know who it was at first until he waved at me and I immediately remembered. I said to myself, absolutely fucking not. Got in my car and went home. Anyways, to end this story, if you're reading this, please don't be this guy. Thanks. 3. I used to live in a seaside town in California. Living there most of my life, I had seen a lot of strange people, but never really had a bad experience until the story I am about to tell. Perhaps it was because we were young that we never paid attention to the things around us. Things were probably happening, but we never saw the horrors of our town. All I know is that we felt safe all the time, even though we shouldn't have. I was 14 and both of my friends had been the same age. One of my friends, Sarah, had been my best friend for 4 years prior and is still my best friend today. Even after 14 long years, my other friend, Alice, had known me for only a year or two prior. and was new to our shenanigans, but fit in all the same. You see, me and my best friend Sarah had been avid role players since the day we had met. I remember all the recesses we spent in elementary school pretending the play structures were castles and that dragons resided in them. When we met Alice, we introduced her to this and she fell in love almost instantly. All of us had created a world where we could be alone and do anything. As time had gone on, we began LARPing, by dressing up in capes and costumes as the characters we had created. We even collected sticks that we swung around and sword fought with, accidentally ending a few times in bruises and scrapes. Role-playing had become a large part of our friendship, and even now we still partake in some of this, but as life goes, when you grow up you rarely find the time to do things. Back then, though, whenever we could, we would band together and go on our own adventure. But time was always limited, unless we had a sleepover together at one of our houses. Most of the time we would all stay at my place. I think why we chose to be at my place so often was because of the freedom we had. My father wasn't a terrible father, but he wasn't the most traditional parent either. He let me and my friends do whatever we chose to do, as long as we weren't getting ourselves into trouble. Because of this, we would walk around at night a lot because it was quiet and the streets were mostly empty of people. Many of our role-playing sessions mostly took place after dark for years without incident. Sure, my friends' parents didn't like it when they realized we had been doing this, but we had done it anyway. At the time, we had specific places that we designated for perfect RP session spots when we didn't feel like wandering. One of them had been the park near my apartment. This park, when you walked into it, had a hill with a walkway that led down into a sandy play area below. This play area had swings, a slide, and some upright pipe-looking things that looked like they could have been from Mario, but blue. But the one thing that I always thought was strange about this play area was a giant cement sculpture that was meant to be climbed on and inside of. This sculpture had holes all over the place, even ones on the bottom where you could climb up underneath it. It kind of reminded me of one of those sculptures that Delia Dietz had in Beetlejuice. Lastly, beyond that playground, down a little hill, it flattened out into a field. This field was huge. It had a bathroom all the way at the other end opposite from the park, and was big enough that it contained 2 baseball diamonds. Because of the baseball areas, there were cages above the pitcher's mound, and the entire field was fenced on one side. The path that led to the play area continued on the other side of this fence, and the field was on the other. So you could tell this was a role player's perfect spot to go all out, especially with LARPing. And when it was at night when no one was around, you could do whatever you wanted without being looked at funny, or being told not to flail giant sticks around. So one crisp night, we 3 girls had a sleepover at my place. We decided that night was a great time to go out and adventure. We threw on our capes and grabbed our sticks that I kept near my front door, and we headed out to that grand old park. It had already been dark at the time, the street lamps glowing with their eerie golden glow above us as we made our way to the park, which had only been about 2 blocks away. When we reached the park, we made our way down the path while we talked excitedly about our game. I remember as we approached the top of the hill that overlooked the play area, I had the feeling that we weren't alone. But we continued into the park anyway, making our way down the hill. A moment after, I felt uneasy though. We noticed we really weren't alone. Seeing the strange sculpture from above on the walkway, we had seen a dark silhouette of a man sitting inside. This person looked large compared to us, and they certainly weren't giving off good vibes. Although they weren't doing anything. Because of this, we decided to bypass the park and continue on through the giant grass field. At this point, all 3 of us continued on talking about our game. We didn't think anything of it. This park often had teenagers messing around at night drinking, or the random homeless person just trying to sleep or take a break. We had already made it about halfway across the large dark field when I had this nagging feeling to look behind us. I turned and saw the dark figure of the man we saw in the sculpture, making his way down the small grassy hill onto the field. I told them both what was happening, and they too looked behind, seeing the man walking. At that point, we all started to get uneasy. At this point, I had just hoped that he happened to be walking in the same direction, that this guy just then decided to get going somewhere for some reason, but nothing about it really felt that way, especially when the silhouette's pace began to quicken. With how rigid this man walked and the strides he took, he seemed like he could have been on drugs and looking to possibly start trouble. He looked like he could start charging at us at any moment. Thoughts of this guy mugging us or sexually assaulting us flooded my brain, but I tried to reassure myself that this guy would be really stupid attacking 3 girls, especially when they all had sticks the size of Gandalf's staff. We kept walking in the direction of the bathroom and decided among ourselves that we would stop at a picnic table not too far from it. I honestly don't remember why we decided to do this. I think we were trying to pretend we didn't notice this guy and play it cool. Or maybe it was because we wanted to be ready and facing this guy if he wanted to start something. Either way, the bench was sitting directly under one of the streetlights, so we were in direct view of anyone who could have been watching what might take place. Whatever it had been, this had been our plan. We kept looking behind us, and the man was getting closer and closer, gaining on us. This bench wasn't much further, but it had felt like we were walking across a huge expanse. Although it was dark, we could see him doing something with one of his hands. At the time, I'm pretty sure I was afraid of him having a weapon. But as he got closer, I started to get the picture of what he might have been doing. At this, we had sped up our pace a bit, rounded out of the open gate on the fence and made it to the bench. We quickly swiveled and sat on the bench so we were facing this guy. He made it to the gate and stopped at the opening. Now illuminated by the streetlight, we could see him. He was playing with himself. He was tall, thin, and was almost completely bald. This guy had a blank 1,000-mile stare, and although this guy was touching himself, his eyes flashed murderously. This guy was most definitely tweaked out and thinking about doing something bad. But to our relief, the crazy pervert stood there for a minute, looking at us, then just disappeared back into the darkness towards the playground. We waited for a while until we saw the guy disappearing out of the park, up the road, and far away before we moved from the bench. I could tell all of us were uncomfortable and kind of freaked out about what happened, but we kept making jokes about it. We joked about how he was rolling dice very intensely because he wanted to play an RPG with us. Yeah, we were kind of messed up kids. We were fully aware of what happened, we just didn't take it very seriously. After that, though, we decided to go back to my place because none of us felt like it was worth sticking around after that. Plus, the mood was utterly ruined. None of our parents heard about it after it happened, though, and things went on as normal. We started to go to that park less at night. It never really felt the same after that. We talked about it now and again, but over time we put it out of our minds. I remember for the longest time we normalized it. And in my mind it kind of set in as not being that big of a deal. Nothing happened, you know? But even then, and after all those jokes we made, looking back on it, it's really fucked up. How we took it, what that guy did, how stupid we were. But thank God we had those sticks, or who knows what the hell he would have done to us. It's scarier now to me than it was at the time it happened. To this day, I've never had another experience like that, and have moved away from my childhood home. I hope that none of us have to go through something like that again. Creepy possible sex offender tweaker in the park. Let's not meet again. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 388. Well, that brings us to Monday once again. I hope you all had a very pleasant weekend, and I certainly hope I did too. I guess we'll find out. Currently recording this at 7:30 on a Friday morning. Trying to get everything wrapped up for the weekend. Wasn't sure if I was going to be able to this week because of how iffy I've been feeling. But we'll see how it goes. I will be suspending the live streams for a little bit while I get myself in order. But as soon as I am, guarantee I'll be back at it. I've even been looking at a little microphone I can attach to the side of my Vive headset, just so you don't have to listen to all the loud, obnoxious breathing, because it certainly annoys me when I hear it back. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.